So, without any further ado, let me introduce our speaker. We are joined by Andy from the History of Africa podcast. And without any further ado, take it away, Andy.
I'm sorry, I can't get over that this whole thing started with a cat jumping off of a desk. That's beautiful. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining. Today I'm going to be talking about, well, along with our theme of contingencies, what's a contingency for when the colonial state apparatus fails? Imagine, for example, that you're living in a society which has been conquered, which has been colonized. They set up a new government, ostensibly for the idea to maintain a new social order. What happens when that new social order fails? What happens when the new economic order fails? What happens when the colonial state fails? This is a very rare instance in history, but I think that this might be one of the most interesting examples, the Fante Confederation of 1868, when the British colonial apparatus in southern Ghana failed. Now, a little bit of about the Fante Confederacy is that it's pretty understudied in Ghanaian history. Many Ghanaian social studies units barely include it at all or don't include it at all. This is for a few reasons, I think. First of all, it's overshadowed by the later independence movement, like the 1948 Accra riots and, the rise of the CPP and Kwame Nkrumah and the like. It's also, when it comes to early resistance against British colonialism, very much overshadowed by the Ashanti resistance, which took place a bit earlier. And for that reason, it's kind of put on the backwater when it comes to Ghanaian history. It has these two big things on either end of it, Ashanti resistance before it and the independence movement after it, which seem to be, occupying a much bigger part of the Ghanaian national consciousness. But regardless, I still find the Fante Confederacy incredibly interesting, as it shows a quite early and interesting example of consciousness against colonialism. And interestingly enough, it does so when colonialism was barely even a thing in Ghana in the formal sense, when it was still developing. And the fact that it arose so early is just fascinating to me. Now, for a little bit of context, for those unfamiliar with Ghana, the southern and central area of the modern Republic of Ghana is mostly Akan, which is a cultural and linguistic group, which includes a few different groups of people within it. One of them is the Ashanti, and the other is the Fante. These are the two largest groups within the Akan greater culture. And, well, for most of history, with the rise of nations and the like, these weren't really solidified identities that people held. These are more vague cultural groups of politically disunited people who wouldn't even necessarily think of themselves as a single united culture, as was, the case with most of the planet in the late 17th century. But that starts to change in the late 17th century when the Ashanti Empire is born. It's united under a king named Ose Tutu, who essentially brings the Ashanti out from under the tributary status to another hostile kingdom in Denshira, and eventually brings them to become the most powerful and dominant group in not only southern Ghana, but eventually in the country as a whole, and soon one of the most significant states in West Africa as a whole. Fante political unity starts to emerge as a direct result of Ashanti political unity. Notably, in the early 18th century, Ashanti expansion starts to take place around the coast, and this really worries the people living here. And this is where Fante consciousness starts to come from, where people start thinking of themselves as part of a greater confederacy. Now, in response to Ashanti expansion, Fanteman unites into a formal alliance, but not necessarily a single state. It's a vague confederation in which different city-states, which are still the main way which people think of themselves, they're still the main primary identity, these become the main political units in Fanteman. They're united not so much in a political sense as they are united in their goal of resisting the Ashanti expansion. The two most important cities are Abra and Mankesim, though there's some others that play a role as well, but those two generally compete for being the most significant. There's also this new military institution called the Asafu Company, and a pretty important thing to note is that Ashanti expansion was largely due to a large and professional army of conscripts that were trained and well-armed. This was something that was quite novel for a region which, for most of its history, had been defined by a small warrior caste. This new system could easily envelop and defeat any sort of small warrior caste. And so, well, commoner conscription was needed. The Sappho companies are essentially these little militias that form in various Fante cities. A Fante city could have anywhere between like 3 and 4 Sappho companies, and they're made up of foreigners, or not foreigners, of commoners. And these commoners, essentially, this is a way to get commoners into the army. And this confederation proves pretty successful in fighting off Ashanti advances. The Ashanti invade in 1750 and 1772, especially finding some success in 1772, but their success is pretty limited, which is kind of a testament to how effective Fante resistance was, as most places were not very effective at fighting off Ashanti expansion. Both the Fante and Ashanti used firearms extensively during this time, and well, the way that they are acquiring these firearms is through foreign trade. Ghana for a while has been at the essentially the main place where Europeans are coming to trade in West Africa, and I mean pretty much all Europeans, even the ones you don't think of as colonial powers. So yeah, you have the Portuguese, French, Dutch, British, the people you think of as colonial powers, but also Danes, Swedes, and even the Kingdom of Brandenburg, Prussia, which is one that not a lot of people expect. The Danish in particular were not just there for a little bit, they were actually a major power in the area, a major commercial power in the area for a long time. They provide essentially gun models, which are then both imported as well as manufactured locally in Ghana. This is one of my favorite examples that kind of shows the significance of firearms in the culture of this time. This is an umbrella handle, which is clearly meant to mimic a firearm. This goes into a few different places. Essentially, due to the rising influence of European mercantile powers in the area, essentially they end up aligning themselves with different local groups. In the case of the British, they mostly align themselves with the Fante. This is because, they can rely on them for protection for their forts, which are actually quite vulnerable if they don't have local support. Now, things start to change in the year 1821. That year, the Ashanti invade, not before 1821, in 1807, really, and then later in 1813 as well. The Ashanti invade, and this is when the first Fante Confederation fails. They actually do, their entire army gets annihilated in 1813. The Ashanti use this encirclement tactic, where essentially if you lose a battle against them, you're going to pay for it very dearly. And that is what ended up happening. And as a result, the entire social and political system of Fanteman was essentially transformed overnight. All of the Fante local rulers were forced into a very predatory tributary agreement with the Ashanti. While they remained de facto independent, they were essentially tributaries paying pretty heavy taxes. Now, the British are very worried about this, and they actually try to help the Fante and fail enormously. The British end up essentially binding their fate to the Fante in 1813 by sending them arms and support against the Ashanti invasion. And not only do the Fante that they are supporting lose, in fact, the Ashanti learn about this and strike back against the British and even capture one of their forts, which is a pretty big deal. I believe it was not at Salt Pond. I believe it was at Komenda where they capture the fort. And this is a pretty big deal. Now, the British do eventually strike back one final time. In 1821, things really changed. The British nationalized the company that had been acting in West Africa. So this wasn't a formal colonial, like these forts that have been there before weren't formally like British territory. They were owned by a British company that was chartered by the government. When they annexed that company, all of the previous treaties that they had signed with the Ashanti were null and void. Now, as part of that crushing defeat that the British had experienced in 1813, the company had signed a treaty of submission to the Ashanti, essentially agreeing to trade with them exclusively and the like. When they get nationalized, this treaty gets brought to an end, which results in war between the British and the Ashanti. Now, when the British go to war in 1821, they essentially go around trying to convince the defeated Fante to rise up to support them, which they do. And this results at first in another disaster. At the Battle in Samankau, the Ashanti crush the British and Fante alliance again. But in 1831, the British and Fante finally get a victory after all these years. They turn back the Ashanti at the Battle of Catamanso, which is a pretty big deal. It results in essentially the creation of this informal protectorate status. Fanteman is essentially independent, but under a British protectorate. This starts to change in 1844 when a group of British diplomats arrive and sign this treaty called the Bond of 1844. This results in the creation of a formal British colony in the region with some autonomy, but very little compared to before. The local governments are basically replaced with a British colonial apparatus. In 1853, things get a lot more questionable with an incredibly unpopular head tax. Fante people were never used to paying a centralized tax to a centralized government. After all, even during the era of the Confederation, each city had essentially been a military alliance more than anything else. So this idea that you pay taxes to anyone other than your local king was highly foreign to them. When the British try to implement this, it gets a lot of pushback. Now we fast forward to the year 1863, and this is something to keep in mind. All this resentment that is growing against increasingly apparent British colonial rule in southern Ghana. It's become more and more obvious to the Fante people that this is not just a case of being a British protectorate, but is increasingly becoming a British colonial possession. In 1863, some new things were going on in Britain as well. Britain had one of its first elected liberal governments, which was beginning to openly question the point of British presence in southern Ghana. After all, the British presence in the area had been initially to participate in the slave trade, something which was now thoroughly illegal in the British Empire. So what was the point of being there? Sure, they had their own ideological justifications and all that, but at the end of the day, there was no material benefit from the British being there at this point. Meanwhile, their official justification of protecting the Fante was becoming harder to justify because many Fante leaders were becoming increasingly apparent that they did not necessarily trust British commitment to their protection. One of these guys was a man named Kwame Achiampong, who is the Prince of Winneba. We're going to talk about him because he's going to be a pretty big deal. But he's very nervous about British commitment to protecting them against the Ashanti. And this all comes to a head in 1863 when we have the Second Anglo-Ashanti War. Now, this is the most obscure of the four Anglo-Ashanti Wars, and it is the one that is the most clear-cut Ashanti victory. While there's very little in terms of borders changing, it's a war that dramatically undermines the trust in the British among Southern Ghanaians. First of all, Southern Ghanaians do almost all of the fighting. The British, which do turn up, are mostly people from the West Indies. The British at this point still operate under this pseudo-scientific racialist theory where they think that people of African descent are just immune to African diseases, and that the reason why when Europeans show up to Africa, they just drop dead is not, because of medical care or the location of these settlements on mosquito beds. Rather, they figure that it's just due to some natural racial immunity to malaria. And plot twist, that's not actually true. Turns out that the British West Indian regiments die of malaria at a very similar rate to the European regiments. Turns out that it's actually not a racial factor. Meanwhile, the Ashanti, of course, being people who had lived in the area for freaking ever, have long since developed medical techniques to try to minimize malaria and sanitation techniques to limit its spread. So this is essentially a war that's won by medical knowledge, where the Ashanti are able to reduce their attrition that they suffer due to malaria. It's a very interesting story, but what's really important is that the Ashanti win here, and the British become increasingly skeptical of the point of being in southern Ghana. So too do the Fante people, who are becoming skeptical of the British's ability to protect them. In this particular case, the British had tried to protect them from the Ashanti and failed. So that is a very, very telling point, where if you are a Fante person at this time, you're thinking, well, what's the point of us having these people here? Their whole point in being here is to protect us from the Ashanti, apparently. That's the whole reason we tolerate them being here. And they can't even do that. But the real straw that breaks the camel's back is this land trade that the British agree to with the Dutch. Now, by this point in time, all of those other European powers had long since left the Gold Coast. The British and Dutch were the only ones left. Now, these are two maps that I made for the podcast that pretty well illustrate this land trade that occurred. Now, following the Anglo-Ashanti War in 1863, This disputed territory here was annexed by the Ashanti. Meanwhile, you might notice that this Dutch territory is kind of incoherent, whereas the British have this one relatively like unified block of territory for which they can trade and transport goods and materials. The Dutch are in this weird position where they have a lot of coastal forts that don't really lead anywhere in the case of hostile relations with the British. Sure, during good times where the Ashanti and Dutch are able to actually go through British territory, this works out fine. But with the increasingly apparent bad relations between the two, this is becoming harder and harder. So essentially, the Dutch and British come to a treaty where they agree that in a essentially desperate attempt by the Dutch to save their failing colonies in the Gold Coast, they agree to trade land with the British to turn their territories into a more cohesive unit. So you can see that they give up these territories here in Accra, closer to Winneba. They give up some of the territories over here near Anamabo. And in exchange, the British give to them some of these territories over here, specifically Comenda, so they can link up to their main, most important fort here in Elmina. The mistake that the British make here is that they don't ask the Fante. Elmina is a pretty strange case because culturally, the people of Elmina aren't exactly Fante at this point. They're kind of closer to Ashanti culturally. But Comenda and some of these other areas and townships around here are culturally Fante. So many people in this area are now saying not only are the British failing to protect us, but they're actively giving our land away to, well, the Dutch, who are, friends with the Ashanti. They are actively undermining Fante security. This is when the Confederation is born. In 1868, fundamentally fed up with British nonsense, the Fante elites convene at what's called the 1868 Makassar Conference. This is where the kings of the three most important Fante cities at this point, Makassar, Abura, and Goma, they convene and agree to declare autonomy from the British. Now, this is an easy mistake to make, but they are not actually seeking formal independence from the British, but rather local self-government. You could compare this more to, say, how British colonies work in Canada or Australia, where the white settlers have a fair amount of autonomy from the British colonial government. Now, believe it or not, the British are actually initially fine with this development. Again, the newly elected Liberal government is kind of skeptical of the point of this very expensive venture in southern Ghana. And they're saying, well, we don't really trade here. We don't really have any purpose for being here. We're just paying a lot of money for military outposts here. Why shouldn't we allow the Fante to protect themselves? Now, there's two classes that emerge that are very heavily in support of the Confederation, and this is going to end up being very important. These are what are called compradores and the local nobility. Now, compradores is a term that gets used a lot in theory of understanding colonialism. It essentially means, well, for starters, it comes from a Spanish word meaning buyer. It means someone who essentially works as a local assistant to a European merchant. Local nobility, of course, refer to local Fante nobility. That one's a bit more straightforward. But the main difference between the compradores and the local nobility is their different interests and their different cultures. The compradores are very close with European merchants. They have adopted European cultures in many ways. They usually speak English as a first language and Fante as a second language in Ghana. They often dress like Europeans. They talk like Europeans. They act like Europeans. They're usually Christian. And in many cases, compradores are actively pretty disdainful of Fante culture. There's a very good quote by a historian, Samuel Arhin, who talks about this, where the compradores were very much in favor of implementing a system of education, which we'll talk about later, because they saw it as necessary to educate the Fante out of their Fantiness. It's a very strange system where it's essentially Fante people who believe themselves to have surpassed their own culture by westernizing. The local nobility don't necessarily see it that way. They are, of course, Fante, and they are proud of being Fante. This is the system through which they have derived their power and the one that they are in favor of. Now, these two groups have different cultures and interests, but they managed to come together on the agreement. Even though, the compradores are very friendly to the British, they do believe that self-government is the only way forward. After all, the British have failed to protect them and will likely do so again. Now, strangely enough, even before, and still operating as an autonomous part of the British Empire, The Fante Confederation creates a war council in February of 1868 and goes to war with the Dutch. Now, of course, the Dutch now possess two territories that are predominantly Fante and were places that had consented to the Fante Confederation. So when they try to move into the town of Comenda, which was, one of the places, that the Dutch had received from the British trade in an effort to try and, link up their own forts in the region, they get resisted by the Fante and eventually turned back. And then, and this is where things get a little bit dicey, the Fante move on to begin to besiege Elmina. Now, this is where things get a bit dicey because Elmina is not a traditionally Fante territory. The region had never taken part in the Confederation and had not agreed to be part of it. The region had always considered itself more aligned with the Ashanti as opposed to the Fante. It's one of the few places in southern Ghana that had. And in fact, many of the people within Elmina, due to its mercantile connections with the Ashanti Empire, were essentially Ashanti settlers. So they are very resistant towards this idea, not to mention the Dutch, who are very hesitant to, allow their primary mercantile center in the area to be besieged. So there's essentially, within the first month of its existence, the newly founded Fante Confederacy is at war with the Dutch. Now, later in 1868, there is this idea of a constitution which arises among the compradores. Of course, the compradores are the ones to actually do so because they are the ones who are literate and educated in Western literacy, right? So most Fante nobility, if they were literate, were usually literate in Arabic, which most weren't, but that was a form of writing which existed in Ghana at the time. But when it comes to writing in the Latin script, compradores were the ones who would do that. So they convened to create a Fante constitution. And strangely enough, they do elect a pretty influential figure. Now, you might have remembered a couple slides back, I mentioned that guy, Kwame Achiampong. He is better known by his name, Gardi IV. At the time, he's a prince of Winneba. He is later made into the Omanhene, or king of Winneba, a city in southern Ghana. Now, he is a rare case because he is both a local nobleman and a successful merchant, meaning that he has a lot in common with both the compradores and the local nobility. He's a bit of a compromise candidate. He also holds many of the same views of the compradores in that he's very westernized culturally. You can definitely see that in this image with his essentially using the dress of what would be, a modern major general, so to say. He is a very interesting figure. He's very successful from a mercantile venture he ran with his brother. Now, as a result of that, he is actually someone who's pretty well liked and respected among both the compradores and the nobility, which is pretty rare in this case. Usually their interests are pretty firmly opposite to each other. Now, in the 1869 Constitution, I say that because that's when it actually gets voted on and agreed to be passed. A few things are created in an attempt to flesh out this new Fante government. For starters, they create this position of king president, who's going to be essentially the head of Fatima, the head of state of this autonomous territory. This is to be a rotating position held by different members of the nobility by election from their counselors, who are fellow nobles. Basically, the nobles pick from among themselves who's going to rule. This National Assembly is then elected by universal male suffrage, a National Assembly is elected by universal male suffrage, which is very unusual at this time and very ahead of its time in some regards. And strangely enough, they would be able to impeach the king president and his counselors. This is meant to be a bit of a compromise. You can see that the king president and the counselors are sort of a position for that local noble class, whereas the National Assembly is pretty clearly created to be a part of this, sort of comprador interest. This is also, there's a few other interesting things within it, but one of the most interesting elements about the Constitution is that it's the first constitution in the world, as far as I know, to make education a constitutional right. Of course, that makes a lot of sense when you consider that, Constitution for the Fante Confederation was meant to be a form essentially of cultural indoctrination, with the Fante compradores favoring the idea of, using this educational system to essentially westernize the Fante people like themselves. This doesn't work. Sadly, you could say the Fante Confederation almost immediately begins to collapse after it's created. The biggest one is money. That's the biggest problem. First of all, in order to raise money, they pass a head tax. This essentially undermines the entire point of the Confederation from its beginning. Remember that a lot of the resentment against the British was because of this head tax. A lot of essentially the Fante were not used to paying taxes towards the central government, and they were not cool with that idea. So many had revolted against the British and supported this confederation because they had hoped that that would be a thing of the past. And hey, they immediately pass it. They immediately pass a new head tax to replace it. They also implement road duties. This is a fairly decent idea and is usually how monarchies in the area raised most of their money. It's how the Ashanti Empire raised a good deal of its federal funds as well, or royal funds as well. This is a bit of a problem though, because, well, they're at war with the Dutch. There's not a lot of trade going in and out of southern Ghana as this war is going on. So the road duties are a lot less productive than you'd expect. In reality, the main source of funding for the Fante Confederation was Gardy's wallet. He was essentially paying for all of it out of pocket. And yes, he was a wealthy man. He was actually one of the first African multimillionaires to come out of Ghana. But I mean, his pockets still have a limit, and he starts to run into that limit after about 2 years of funding an entire government. There's also the issue of British approval, or, well, the decline of it. The Fante Confederation, yes, the British have supported the idea of self-rule. They did not support the idea of the Fante trying to defeat the Dutch and undermine British diplomacy. Again, the British had agreed to trade these territories in a way that undermined Fante sovereignty. So they did not want the Fante to undermine their own decision to do so. This decision to declare war on the Dutch essentially ended the tepid British support for the Fante Confederation. Meanwhile, the British managed to defeat the Dutch diplomatically. In 1870, that very brief period of land swaps comes to an end. Ironically, this is largely the case worth it. Elmina is on the verge of collapse, and their other territories are not nearly as valuable. So they decide to cut loose. And in 1870, the Dutch hand over the entirety of their territories to the British in exchange for some territories in Indonesia. This essentially ends the entire point of the Fante Confederation. After all, if you're an ordinary Fante person who had supported the Confederation, why did you do so? Probably because of the head tax and because of the British trade of territories. Neither of those are a problem now. The Dutch were gone from the coast, and, well, the Confederation's implementing a head tax anyways. There's also a great deal of infighting. Abra and Mangkesim are two territories which had traditionally been rivals in terms of control in the Fante Confederation before 1821, and it turned out that that didn't change after in 1868. The two kings still feuded constantly over power. Gardy himself tried to essentially compromise between the two, and this didn't end up working. There's also the issue of cultural fissures. This is the quote from Clement Arhin I was talking about, where it's the compradores in the entire mission of theirs was essentially revolved around the superiority of quote unquote educated, westernized Fante over non-westernized Fante. Essentially trying to implement European lifestyles among people who didn't really want them. Most ordinary Fante were perfectly fine with living life according to their culture that they had grown up with. While maybe they might be interested in certain elements, they were certainly not interested in having them foisted upon them in the way that the compradores tried. So ultimately, the Confederation fails. Gardy is actually taken out of power by the feuding kings of Abra and Mangkesim, who begin rotating amongst themselves for the last few years of its existence. It doesn't go out in any set date, rather it just sort of fades out of its ability to govern. And gradually, it's essentially something that exists only in name before, well, the charade is up and it stops existing altogether in 1873. The other thing that really brings it to an end is that in 1873, the British very firmly defeat the Ashanti in the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, really bringing an end to the fear of Ashanti invasion of Fanteman. So then why does any of this matter? What's so interesting about this? Well, I think that it aligns very well with this conference's themes of contingencies. For for starters, this shows a contingency for what happens when the colonial government fails. It also really puts us into the shoes, like studying this topic puts you into the shoes of people who had been collaborating with colonial governments. In the modern era of, essentially Pan-African nationalism and beyond, it can be kind of hard to imagine why African rulers collaborated with colonial powers. This kind of gives us a look into why they did and what were the limits of their collaboration. When were they willing to stop and say, actually, this isn't worth it for us anymore? And what should they do when it isn't worth it for them anymore? Now, I hope you all enjoyed this talk. I'm now going to be moving on to the Q&A portion. So, Sam, can we take it away?
We certainly can. We've got a question. Oh, and she's gone. She's been enjoying the cat enjoyed the talk too. So Robert Ross asks, after the end of the slave trade, what were the British and the Dutch trading with the Fante?
Oh, that's actually a really interesting question. Strangely enough, the answer is not much. These after the end of the slave trade, the region became a lot less valuable to the Europeans, in particular because of the decline there. There was of course still trade going on, but not to the same extent as before, and more importantly, not things that couldn't be traded for elsewhere. There was one major exception to this, though, and that was cola nuts. Cola nuts are a very valuable substance around the world at the time, and they are grown pretty extensively in the Ashanti Empire. And of course, if you are British, then, the road to the Ashanti Empire goes through Fante. And so cola nuts were by far the biggest. Gold was also a pretty big one as well. Particularly the region around modern day Obuasi in Ghana has some of the largest gold mines in the world at that point. Gold had been quite valuable at the time and remained quite valuable. In fact, this was a bit of a problem for both the Ashanti and the Fante, that the dependence on gold in the economy led to a lot of instability, where whenever there was essentially a global gold rush anywhere around the world, it would decline the value of gold and lead to some issues within the Ashanti Empire. In fact, gold was a plentiful enough resource there that it was not used extensively as a currency, strangely enough. Part of the one of the most interesting elements was the use of cowrie shells as currency. Now, cowries were used throughout many different parts of Africa at this point, but part of the reason for that is that, if gold is a plentiful resource, it's one that doesn't really make an especially stable or good currency, if it's plentiful, it's not that valuable. Furthermore, because of its use, because it was used so extensively as an exported product, you don't want to necessarily be exporting your currency in large numbers to the point where you are, going to run out of it, and that's going to cause issues with, the actual ability to spend and use your currency. So that is a very interesting question. So gold and cola were the big ones, but keep in mind that the answer is kind of not much, and that's part of the reason why they were divesting from the region at the time.
If we have no further questions, I know you were hoping to finish it a little bit earlier. So if there's nothing else from the chat, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Like you mentioned at the start, it's an overlooked part of the history of the region, and I found that fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Yeah. Thank you very much.